So why do states democratize? We've got this idea of evolution versus revolution. In the UK case, obviously, we had a case of evolution. Here in America, we've got the case of democracy as a more revolutionary process with elements of evolution as well. So we started off with 13 American colonies that rejected the British Parliament's right to govern them without representation. So look at those DC license plates, taxation without representation. This is what did it. They created 13 self-governing states, each with its own provincial congress. In 1773, you had the Boston Tea Party, which epitomized this, being taxed by the Brits and not their own representatives. So again, taxation without representation. It wasn't taxation, and it wasn't just a lack of representation. It was this combination of economics and politics. These guys came together in 1774 in the First Continental Congress to coordinate their struggle, and ultimately what became an armed conflict with Great Britain. At first, this was a struggle with the British Parliament, and then they decided that the British Crown, which wouldn't intervene, also lacked legitimacy. So again, this was a struggle with the British Parliament because of this taxation without representation, and it wasn't until the Crown wouldn't take our side that we decided that the British monarch lacked legitimacy. At the Second Continental Congress, the Americans then created their own state and signed on to this Declaration of Independence, which rejected the monarchy. There's lots of talk about civic duty, about being prepared and willing to fight for the rights and liberties of their countrymen and countrywomen. But at the end of the day, there stood a pot of money. And in the new book project that I'm working on right now, I'm sorry, here's a little person who's bothering me. What do you need, Anj? Quick. Okay, bye. So at the end of the day, we're talking about there was a lack of willingness on the part of many people to actually go and fight against the British. If you go through the history books, you'll find that people got involved in the fight not because of this sort of fervor, this excitement about democracy, but they got involved in it because they were poor and they could actually get a wage to go off and fight. And then it turns out many of them didn't get their wages, and so they ran away from the army en masse. So from the start, by 1781, as you know, we were quote unquote free. We were independent. But from the start, just looking at the U.S. and U.K. cases, we can identify some similarities and potential hypotheses with respect to democratization. This is a question that I would normally throw at you if you were sitting in front of me, but since you're not, I'll throw out one which I've been stressing the whole time, which is economic grievances. And what I want you to do is I want you to draw some connections. Think about what prompted the rebellion in America, what prompted various rebellions in the UK case. What led to the Magna Carta? Why was it that the barons were upset? Again, the answer here is that the king tried to increase revenues from the manors to make up for a lost tax base, after he lost Normandy. So this goes back to the idea where he was increasing revenues, increasing taxes, and they wanted more of a say. This was essentially more taxation without representation, and it angered the barons. And so you can go through this and you can trace this process back many times, where economics is what spurs demands for more political liberalization. And you'll see this in the future cases as well. At first, we'll go back here. At first, we're talking about a very weak central state, as I'm sure you're familiar with. It even lacked an ability to conduct foreign relations. We had the Articles of Confederation, which couldn't tax. They couldn't create a central currency. They couldn't function without unanimous consent. So it was a very weak state that we had at first. In 1788, they ratified the new Constitution, which is our Constitution, the way we know it now, and plus a Bill of Rights, which was tagged on at the first Congress in 1789 to protect individuals from what seemed like a stronger state. Again, this is now that we have a stronger state, we need some sort of protections against it. The Constitution was a compromise. You had the Federalists, led by Hamilton, on one side that wanted a strong central state, the ability to tax, create a central bank, etc. And then you had the Democratic Republicans on the other side, led by Jefferson, who wanted to really minimize the size of the state, including the military. So they were following a much more liberal path. So it took about 15 years to actually hammer all this stuff out. Now, compare it to England, and this was not evolutionary, right? This was quite revolutionary. So let's go through some historic milestones with respect to the growth of the state. Um, and one thing you'll see here is that the expansion of the state is frequently triggered by crisis. So we could talk about the physical growth of the United States. We had the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. We got Florida from Spain in 1819. The Southwest was won through the Mexican-American War in 1846. But if you look at these other 4 out of these 6 periods of major state expansion that are listed right over here were really triggered by crisis. Economic divisions primarily were what led to the Civil War. Right, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. The abolition of slavery was just a benefit that came out of the Civil War, and it was really made for more strategic means than anything else. If you look through the history of why Lincoln signed on to this, Lincoln didn't come out and support an abolition of slavery when he was running for president. Right? He never would have won. But the 13th Amendment got passed as part of a strategic decision during the Civil War. So in terms of increasing the size of the state, in this case, the first real big increase was during the Civil War. War was a catalyst for increasing the size of the state. You needed a big state to wage a civil war and then rebuild after that war. So if you go back to the state building, the evolutionary state stuff that we talked about with respect to Europe, this really fits that sort of model to a certain degree, where the state expands in order to fight its various wars. It needs the ability to administer, tax, allocate spending. All these things happen as a result of war. Same thing here. The Progressive Era from 1903 to 1920, the second right here, it was a second period of state strengthening, really to regulate business. It was designed to lower inequality, to fight corruption, and this included creating the Federal Reserve, which, as you know, is our central bank. It is, quote, the lender of last resort. And finally, in 1913, you had the 16th Amendment, which allows for a national income tax for the first time. But then we get to World War I, which is the third major expansion. And here, obviously, war is the catalyst. World War I increases the size and power of the state dramatically. Although right afterwards, you have a period of isolation. And then in the 1920s, you have the boom-bust cycle. We have the crash. And then in the early 1930s, this leads to the New Deal. Okay, so here, again, crisis. Economic ruin was the catalyst of the next big growth of the state in the United States. The state began subsidies to farmers under the New Deal in order for them to limit production so that they wouldn't flood the market with foodstuffs and devalue that food that's being sold. You had stock market regulation for the first time. The state became involved in things that today would be called socialist, right? Electric production, Social Security, and welfare. If someone proposed those today, I guarantee you everyone would say, this is a socialist agenda. But hey, we've got them, and we've got them thanks to the New Deal, which came about as a result of economic ruin, again, as crisis enveloped the state. And so with all these things, the stock market regulation, Social Security, welfare, these subsidies, with all these things, you have the expansion of the state to administer, to manage these things. The next expansion took place during World War II. And again, war was the catalyst here. And you had a huge growth of the military. The Bill of Rights was actually thrown out in part for some, right? The Japanese, for example, Japanese Americans were suspended. Many American civil liberties. My grandfather was actually a judge in the federal courts in the early 1950s under the period of McCarthyism. So if you're not familiar with McCarthyism, you can Google it, McCarthyism. McCarthy was a senator, I think he was a senator, some congressman, and he went off and he decided that everybody was a communist. There's a big communist conspiracy. They're surrounding us. And so my grandfather, who happened to have been born in Russia, and he came to America when he was 3 years old, he was a 3-year-old communist, even though that was before the revolution. Still, a 3-year-old communist. And so they suspended him for a little while from the federal courts while they investigated him. So, you know, the Bill of Rights was thrown out for a spell. But all this was spurred by World War II. Okay, Mai. And then the sixth period, the civil rights period, where you have forced integration, Johnson's war on poverty in the 1960s. This was a period which I guess you could argue wasn't spurred by specific economic crisis or military crisis. So this would be one of the outliers. It was this war on poverty was characterized by an increase in low-income housing, trying to eliminate racial discrimination. Nixon went along providing food stamps, fighting inflation with wage and price controls. So these are really some historic milestones in U.S. history, and highlight the expansion of the state. Now, if we were all sitting in class right now, I'd ask you to compare the relationship between war and rights in the UK and the US. And one thing that should stand out is that war really led to the expansion of rights and liberties in both of these, gradually over time. Now, in the UK, war essentially forced democratization and the expansion of the state because they were taxing more, and they increasingly had to give more and more power to people below them who didn't like all this taxation. In the U.S. case, you had this forced expansion of the state and also greater democratization, expansion of suffrage laws, and then especially during the civil rights. Arguably, the civil rights movement started with roles of women and black soldiers in World War II, and then competition during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, when each was trying to demonstrate its own sort of, the superiority of its ideology. In many ways, democratization was spread as a political strategy by empowered elites. Again, the king bargained so he could stay in the game. The Magna Carta was this grand bargain so he could stay in the game, and then you had a series of bargains afterwards. Going back to Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War period, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in large part to win the war. The loyalty and the participation of blacks in the war was important. They made up 10% of the Union Army. And so all these things were strategic by those in charge. Now, note also, though, that war was also used to limit the rights and liberties at times. So the Japanese internment, the Patriot Act more recently, limiting civil rights to a certain extent. So I'm going to go on and talk about the constitutional configuration, but we'll take that in a new slide.